Okay, Tov. Shalom Aleichem. So we got up to the Mishnah on Daf Kuf Tes Zayin, and this is the Mishnah of Nishtana. And as you know, in Mirza Hashem, in not too much time, we'll be hopefully shifting over to Sukkah. Okay, so we had Tibul Rishon in the previous Mishnah, and they brought now the matzah udamoror and shnei tavshilin, and we're ready for Magid. And Magid, of course, begins with the second kos of the Daled Kos. So we finished Kadesh, and now we're up to Magid. And now Mozgulo Kos Sheni. So we're up to Mezigas Kos Sheni. And this is also part of the attempt to arouse the curiosity of the children, because they didn't usually have a second kos of yayin before the Suda. And they already had the first kos for Kiddush, and now all of a sudden they're drinking a second kos. Now, not every question is going to be reflected in the Nishtana. There are many, many questions that the child should be asking if he's clever and he's observant, and he observes different changes. Like, for example, we spoke about Tibul Rishon, that it was unusual before the Suda to have a Tibul of a Yerek. The Nishtana is going to include the second Tibul, but even the first Tibul itself, at least according to some, would arouse the curiosity of the children. And I think I've mentioned in the past that according to the Netziv Mivalozhin, the reason why we wear a kittel at the Seder is to arouse the curiosity of the children. The Netziv also explains that at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, they had special begodim to eat the Korban Pesach. But be that as it may, obviously the child should be asking, why are you wearing a kittel on the night of Pesach? So there are many questions that the child should ask. And we're going to see later on in the Mishnah that the child will ask a different question. Why do we express our gratitude on the night of Pesach? And we're going to answer because if an Adon owns an Eved and he frees his Eved, then the Eved owes him a debt of gratitude. So we have here Tibul Rishon, and now we're ready for Magid. Why do we bring out the matzah and the morah for Magid? And the answer to that is Bavur Zeh. That Bavur Zeh teaches me not only the time that is ripe for Sibri Yitzis Mitzrayim, but that the Sibri Yitzis Mitzrayim should be over the matzah, and that's derived by Shmuel on the previous Amud from Lechem Oni Sha'onim Olav Dvarim Harbe. And the Morah we're going to see, Rabbi Gamliel expects us to explain the Morah, and that's going to be part of Maskel B'Knus. And we haven't yet come to any conclusion about the Shnei Tavshilin, what they symbolize. Perhaps they symbolize the Korban Pesach, perhaps the Korban Chagiga. And now, Mozgulo. Now, the language of Mozgulo appears here in this Mishnah and in the previous Mishnah. Let's go back for a moment to the previous Mishnah on Kuf Yud Daled. And there also, with regard to the first kos, the Mishnah is very consistent, Mozgulo. Now, the word Mozgulo has two meanings. Number one, it means to dilute the concentrated wine. And we said that Shasa Yain Chai, if he drinks concentrated wine, lo yotza, or at least yotza yedei daled kosus, but lo yotza yedei cherus. So cherus requires that you dilute the water, and that's called meziga. Now, there's a second halacha meziga, which applies in general to a koshel bracha. And the Daled Kosos, each and every one of them, in and of themselves, each one is a koshel bracha. But the emphasis here is mazgu lo, which means that they did the meziga on his behalf. On whose behalf? On behalf of the Koreas Haggadah. And the poskim point out here, and we'll go through this later on, that it's not just mozgim lo, that one person does the meziga on behalf of the Kore, but that each person should be mozeg on behalf of someone else. So that derech cherus means that instead of me personally getting involved in my own meziga, I have a servant, so to speak, somebody else who's doing the meziga on my behalf. And the Rambam says that it should be a kos that is noelo, that he has a pleasure for that kos. That's the kos of cherus, in that hakol lefi das hashoseh. No two people are identical in terms of the way they like their kos, their yayin. So we should try to offer different opportunities, possibilities, and each person should choose that which he thinks is his favorite. It should be a shtia noelo, that he has enjoyment from that shtia. Now it's interesting that neither in the previous Mishnah on Kuf Yudal nor in this Mishnah on Kuf Tezayin, with regard to Mezigas Kos Rishon Kos Sheni, is there any recitation of a bracha on the kosos? It could be that the Mishnah felt it was unnecessary to point out that when you drink a cup of wine, you recite Bori Pri Hagafen. That's something that we learned in Masechet Brachas. However, what the Mishnah is going to point out is that there's a special bracha on Achilus Matzah and on Achilus Maror, but the Mishnah completely omits mention of a separate bracha on Shtiyas Daled Kosos. And there are various approaches to answer this question. Some assume that each kos is only a part of a greater mitzvah, which is drinking 4 kosos. And that creates let's call it a technical problem of making a bracha, because the bracha would have to be Asher Kidshanu Mitzosim Tzivanu Lishtos Arba Kosos. But we have a rule that we don't make a bracha on a mitzvah that's obligatory, irrelevant, or shall we say independent of that mitzvah. So take, for example, the first kos. It's a koshel kiddush. And even if we didn't have a mitzvah of Daled Kosos, nevertheless, we would still be required to set up a koshel kiddush like we do on any Shabbos or any Yontif. Pesach is not inferior to any of the other regalim, and it requires a koshel kiddush. So to make a bracha on an action that's obligatory, irrelevant to, and independent of this mitzvah, we don't make a bracha. So that since the kos of kiddush is obligatory, independent of Daled Kosos, we can't say Asher Kidshanu Tzilson Tzivanu Daled Kosos, because at least one out of the 4, and maybe even more than one, is obligatory even without the mitzvah of Daled Kosos. And if you were to make a bracha al shalosh kosos, if you assume that there's no obligation vis-a-vis the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th kosos, then that's not true. The mitzvah is not to drink 3 kosos, but rather 4 kosos. But there's another approach to understanding why there's no bracha on Daled Kosos. And that is that we never make a bracha on a bracha. Let me give 2 examples. When a person finishes a meal, he or she becomes obligated in the mitzvah of Birkas Hamazon. And yet, there's no bracha asher kitshanu b'tzolsev v'tzivanu al Birkas Hamazon. Or, take for example the bracha on Torah study. We're obligated on a daily basis, men and women, to make a bracha on the study of Torah. And yet, we don't have a bracha asher kitshanu b'tzolsev v'tzivanu al Talmud Torah. We just go straight into the bracha without an introductory bracha. And the reason for that is that we don't make a bracha on a bracha, meaning when the mitzvah itself is a bracha, then the bracha supplies the bracha and we don't need to add another bracha. Here too, each one of the Dalet Kosos is a koshel bracha in and of itself. And we're going to recite a bracha on each one of the kosos. On the first Kiddush, on the second Magid Gol Yisrael, the third will be Halil, and the fourth will be, I'm sorry, what did I miss? The second is Gol Yisrael, the third is Birkas Hamazon, and the fourth is Hal. So each of the four kosos has its own bracha, and the bracha is inherent in the mitzvah of that kos. And therefore, to make another bracha, Asher Kitshonu Tzolsev Tzivanu Lishtos Arba Kosos, that we won't do. So again, when the essence of the mitzvah requires a bracha, and the bracha is already embedded in the mitzvah, or the mitzvah exhausts itself in a bracha, like for example, Birchas HaTorah is a mitzvah, and the bracha is the mitzvah, then we don't add a bracha on the bracha to express our obligation to make a bracha. The bracha is there; it's already a given. V'kana ben shoel. So the ben is curious, Nishtana, why are we drinking a second kos before the Suda? It was common and customary to drink wine in the course of a meal, but not before the meal, or at least not two koses before the meal. So Nishtana alayla zeh shemozgim bo kos sheni Chodem HaSeuda. So that's what the sharp Ben HaChacham would ask at this point. V'im ein das beben. The son is not so observant. He's not so sharp and keen. He doesn't realize, isn't there something strange going on? So he accepts, whatever happens. That's like passé. Aviv Malamda. Now, what does Aviv Malamdo mean? So, if you take a look in the Masechet, he says that Aviv Malamdo Lishol. We're not ready for the answer yet. It's not like Aviv Malamdo is going to teach the child what is the meaning of the second kos. He's just teaching the child how to ask a question. And we see from this that the question is part of the mitzvah. The mitzvah of Vigadat Lebincha is not just to tell the son, not just to impart information and educate the son, but there's Shoel and then there's Meshev. So the Haggadah, Vigadat Lebincha, should be a response to a question. The Rambam goes very far with this. The Rambam says that if he has no son to ask the question, then his wife will ask him the question. If he has no wife, then he asks himself the question. Shoel es atzma. There must be she'ela and tshuva. So it's not tshuva without she'ela, it's tshuva after she'ela. So if the son is not on his own taking the initiative to ask the question, then the father has to teach the son to ask the question. So imagine a situation where there's no one to recite the Nishtana, no one's asking the questions. Then he himself will have to ask the questions. Some have the minhag that we all recite the Nishtana in unison, because each one has to be asking a question so that the Magid will be in the form of question and answer. But there's a Yerushalmi here. And if you look in the footnote Chaf Gimel, he quotes the Yerushalmi. Keneged arba bonim dibra Torah. Says the Yerushalmi, one of the four bonim is an Eino Yedei Lishol. And this Mishnah that we're learning now is a reference, or shall we call it an allusion, to that son who is defined as Eino Yedei Lishol. And what does it say? At psachlo tchila. Now, what is at psachlo? Does it mean you teach him, or does it mean you get him to ask the question? And here we're interpreting it as aviv malamdo psachlo, to, in a sense, feed the child the question. Like, didn't you notice something strange? And again, if the child doesn't comment or respond or react, so you say to him, well, do we drink a second course of wine every night? And eventually, the child, even though he's in an Eino Yedei Lishol, will finally be led step by step to ask the question. Now, it's interesting. The next line in that Mishnah says, "Ma nishtana alayla hazeh mikol haleilos." It sounds like you should put a question mark after this "Ma nishtana alayla hazeh mikol haleilos." Alternatively, you could put a comma after Mikol Haleilos. So my question to you is, how do you interpret this Mishnah? When it says Shebechol Haleilos anu ochlim, etc., is that part of the question? Or is that the answer to the question? If you put a question mark after Ma nishtana alayla hazeh mikol haleilos, and you're asking, in what way is this night different than other nights, then we have four answers, at the time of the Mikdash, 5 answers to this question. And the first answer would be, or, alternatively, is kol elos anu ochlim chametzu matzah an explanation or an embellishment of the question itself? Meaning, why is it different? And this night we're eating exclusively matzah and no chametz. And I would like to defend the position that you put a question mark after Ma nishtana alayla hazeh mikol haleilos. And the question is, in terms of the Kedushas Hayom, or in this case, Kedushas Halayla, what is the essence of the Kedushas Halayla? Where do we find a halachic manifestation of the unique Kedushas Halayla of this night? So, for example, if it was Sukkot and I was asking, Ma nishtana alayla hazeh, I would answer you that we sit in Sukkah. If I would ask that question the day of Sukkot, I would say that we take a lulav. What are the unique mitzvos that are generated by this particular Kedushas Hayom? Every regel has its own unique Kedushas Hayom. There's one generic, all-inclusive Kedushas Hayom. That's called Kedushas Hazman, or Kedushas HaRegel, and that would apply to all 3 regalim. But when I hone in on a particular night or day, and I ask, what is the Kedushas Hayom of that day? I'm looking for a mitzvah that's unique to that day. So if I'm asking about Sukkot, let it be Sukkah, let it be Lulav. And in Pesach, I'm looking for unique mitzvos that are generated by the Kedushas Hayom HaMiyuchedes of this particular night. Ma nishtana laila zeh mikol halilos. So that we're going to ultimately answer the questions and fulfill the mitzvah of Sipur of Messiah V'Shvach through the mitzvahs halayla. The Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim reflects on the unique Kiddusha of this night, which generates a mitzvah of Sipur and a number of mitzvos, Doraisa, D'Rabbanan, all of which integrate to form one whole body of Kedushas Hayom. So really, I wouldn't read it Manishtana, I would read it Bamemishtana. No, I would add a base if I had the liberty to do so. But even if I won't add the base, because that I can't do, but I would add the base as an interpretation. It's not Manishtana, what's different about this night, but Bamenishtana. Can you give me an answer to the question, how does this unique Kedushas Hayom express itself? And for that, we have four answers. The first of which is the mitzvah of matzah. The second of which is the mitzvah of moror. The third of which is the mitzvah of achilas haPesach. And the fourth of which is the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is incorporated into the two tibulim, each tibul representing another dimension of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Mesubin is not mentioned in our Mishnah. For some reason, the Mishnah understood that the magic number is 4. There are 4 unique mitzvahs to this night. And since the Mishnah was formulated, was established at the time of the Mikdash, therefore we could arrive at the number 4 without mentioning Mesubin, simply by asking about, or shall we say, answering the question of Bamenishtana with the unique mitzvah of the Korban Pesach. Now, Bisman Hazeh, we don't have the Korban Pesach. How do we arrive at the number 4? And we're going to plug in Mesubin where it used to be the Korban Pesach. And what's a little bit off-center here, it's unbalanced, is that we have 4 mitzvos halayla, but really it's only 3. Because matzah is a mitzvah, moror is a mitzvah, and Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim is a mitzvah. And Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim expresses itself in 2 ways. Number 1, in Shnei Tibulim, and number 2, in Mesubin. So both Shnei Tibulim and Mesubin really belong to one single mitzvah. And at the end of the day, we have 3 mitzvahs. At the time of the Mikdash, you could talk about 4 mitzvahs because you add the Korban Pesach, and then you have Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, plus you have Matzah and Moror, all told 4 mitzvahs. So we call this the fear kashas in English, in Yiddish. But it's really not the fear kashas, it's really the fear terutzim. Because these are all 4 answers to the original question of Ma nishtana laila zeh. How is this night different? In the halachic universe of mitzvos, what makes this night different than any other night? And there are 4 answers to that question, at least at the time of the Mikdash. And they are matzah, moror, Pesach, and Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Yayin is not mentioned. The Daled Kosos is not mentioned. Now, the reason for that, I think, may be technical. And that is that the questions are asked at the beginning of Magid. We haven't yet gotten to Daled Kosos yet. We may be up to pouring the second kos. But that's not a good answer. Because the Basar HaPesach is not eaten until it's ala sova. at the very end of the meal. And that again supports my contention that these are 4 answers and not 4 questions. Because if they were 4 questions, who is going to ask about Korban Pesach when we haven't even begun to eat the Korban Pesach? Unless you assume that the Mishnah is compiling 4 questions from the perspective of the entire Seder, anticipating those unique changes that we make on this night. But again, if you go back to the contention that these are 4 dimensions of the Kiddush Hayom, I could explain that Daled Kosos is not included because Daled Kosos is really Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. And Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim is already covered by Tibulim or perhaps by Mesubin. Okay, now let's take a look at the Rashbam. He says, "Mitam ze anu omrim shebechol los anu ochlim shar yerakos." What does that mean? Shebechol haleilos anu ochlim shar yerakos. See, in the previous question, that I understand. What the Mishnah is telling me is that you have a choice of chametz or matzah. There's nothing compelling you to eat matzah over chametz. But what does it mean? Shebechal los anu ochlim sha'ar yerakos. Kavanasenu lomar shebeshar aleilos ein darkeinu lechazer dafka acharei mora. Ve'anarabba anu machzirin yoser acharei shar yerakos. That's a whole new twist on this second of 4 questions. What it means is that why is it that on this night we're not going to just carte blanche, choose your favorite yerek. You like carrots, you like potatoes, choose whatever you want. That's what we do all the nights of the year. Okay, we eat yerakos, but we're not compelled to eat maror. Is ein darkeinu lachzor dafka acharei maror. So again, I think that fits into our interpretation that this question, like the other questions, is focused on one particular mitzvah that's obligatory, and the obligation is generated by this lila. So this lila is unique in that it generates a mitzvah chiyuv that is not generated in any other night of the year. We're not going to be happy with 2 yerakos, just find any 2 yerakos that you like, but rather we have to go looking for maror. Leave out the word 2 yerakos. Yerakos in general. We're not going to, on any other night of the year, say to you, look, forget about your choice of yerakos. The restaurant gives you a menu, and on the menu you have a whole array of yerakos to choose from. No. On this night, the menu has only one yerek, and that's maror. You've got to find maror. And that's the mitzvah halayla. Now, in the previous question, number 1, it says kulo matzah. Here it doesn't say kulo maror because you're allowed to eat any yerek that you want. We're not going to obligate you to eat tomatoes or potatoes or celery or parsley or carrots or whatever, that we're not going to obligate you. But you certainly have the prerogative of eating Yerakos. So kulo yerek, or shall I say kulo marar, would not be an accurate description of the night. In fact, if you take a look at Tosfos, which is quoted here in footnote number Chavav, he points out that we do eat other Yerakos on this night, normally. Again, we had a case where he didn't have any other Yerek other than Mara. But normally, if he has another Yerek, he is going to eat another Yerek. For Tibul Rishon. So it wouldn't make any sense to say Alayla Zek Kulo Marar, and that's the only Yerek we eat on this night. We are actually obligated to eat another Yerek. Well, it doesn't have to be another Yerek, but there's got to be a Tibul Rishon of Yerek. So again, you might argue, well, the previous Mishnah addresses a scenario where the only Yerek he has is Chazeres, and therefore the question could be in Halayla Zek Kulo Marar, because that's all we're going to eat tonight. But the answer is that the first Tibul in Marar is only coincidental. Marar was not my first choice. It was my last resort. I didn't have any other Yerek in my closet, in my Aronot. So I'm not eating the first Marar and Tibul Rishon as Marar per se. I'm eating it as a Yerek, which means that any Yerek will do. Now here, the Ritva quotes Rashi. You'll see it at the end of footnote Chavav. We don't have this Rashi. And Rashi claims that all Yerakos that we eat on this night are all Marar. What does that mean? He says, Gam sha'ar Yerakos shano ochlim kulam nechshavim beinenu kimarorim. On any other night of the year, we consider the Yerek to be Masok. And tonight we consider it to be Marar. So what does that mean? Kulam nechshavim beinenu k'mara. I mean, the whole year round we consider them as sweet. And tonight we consider them as if they were marar. They're not marar in reality, but we consider them as if they're marar. If I take this Rashi literally, face value to its logical conclusion, then if a person does not have access to marar, any of the various kinds of marar, then he could take a yerek and call it marar. Maybe l'chatchila we want to get something that actually has marirus, and the whole year round it would be considered marar. Considered masal. So tonight we want to consider it as marar. But if we consider it as marar, right, we'd rather eat marar itself, but if we don't have marar, then maybe we could take any yerek and consider it as marar. You designate it as marar. And the reason I would even entertain such a crazy idea, and I admit it's crazy, is because marar bisman hazeh is a zecher. When you have a zecher, then the mind will determine whether it's a zecher or not. Like, for example, we have machlokas whether mitzvah tzrifas kavana or not. Everybody agrees that in a mitzvah of zecher, then you need kavana. If it's not reminding you of what it has to remind you, and you eat it like with a blank head, that's not a zecher. But maybe we could go the other way around. Then when we classify a mitzvah as a zikaron or a zecher, not only are we being machmir, in the sense that we require kavana, but we're also being makil. And marar in, right, let's say horseradish, whatever it is, marar is an archetype of a category, of a class or a species called yerakos. And basically, marar is the yerek that is marar, kishmo kenu, it's bitter. But I can imagine that marar is part of a group, part of a classification called yerakos. And each yerek can be considered marar. I don't know if you're familiar with the word phenomenology, and if that means anything to you. Okay, we're up to question number 3. Shebechalelos anu ochlim basar tzli sholuk umevushal. And this parallels the previous question that on other nights of the year we eat all yerakos. Any yerek is good. Just give me a yerek. We're not compelled to eat one particular yerek. And in basar, if I give you an array of different kinds of basar, like let's say, for example, one kind of basar is called mivushal, right? You took meat and you cooked it in a pot. I mean, that's the Mishnah in Chulin about tipas chalav, a drop of milk that fell on meat that was cooking in a pot. Or, for example, cholent, right? Cholent is usually made in a pot. I don't know if there's such a thing as roast cholent. Maybe you could roast cholent in a pot, in a frying pan or something. I don't know. So the whole year round, you want to eat a piece of cooked meat, like the flanken in cholent, that's fine. It's cooked, it's mevushal, fully cooked. Go ahead, tovul bracha. But on this night, kulot tzli, we have to eat the Korban Pesach tzli. And the Torah tells us tzli eish. And there's an entire perek earlier in Pesachim about how you get tzli eish. How do you produce basar Pesach that's tzli eish? Now, what is sholuk? He says that sholuk is mevushal harbe me'od. It's like it's overcooked. I don't know why the Mishnah in the Nishtana has to add sholuk. It's basically mevushal. Nor for us, it's not mevushal the way you normally would cook it, but it's overly cooked. You left it there for hours in the cooking. He has here another interpretation of the word sholuk, in which it means undercooked. Now, I'm wondering how the child is so sharp that he realizes that on this night, kulot tzli. I mean, tzli is a very tasty way of eating meat, roast meat. So let's make roast meat for Pesach. I mean, in our house, we eat roast meat on Sukkot. We eat roast meat on Shavuos. buy a French roast. I remember the days that my wife would ask me if I was on a trip to America to bring back French roast. Of course, if you're in Flatbush in Brooklyn and your wife sends you to Pomegranate, if you're familiar with that store, you better have a very big check, if you want to buy a French roast. It's quite expensive, but it's one of the most popular stores for Jewish, for Orthodox Jews in America, Pomegranate. So once again, if I go back to my contention that these are not 4 questions, but 4 answers, and there's only one question, and that is Ma Nishtana Laila Zeh. What halachically, al pi mitzvahs HaTorah, makes the Kedushas HaLaila unique, and it generates its own mitzvahs? And the answer is tzli. Tonight we have a mitzvah of eating basar tzli, namely the basar of the Korban Pesach. If, on the other hand, the Ma Nishtana is 4 questions, not 4 answers, then it's a little bit odd to ask the question that tonight we're eating tzli. What is it? Once in a blue moon we eat tzli? Is that what I'm meant to assume? That tzli is an unusual way of eating meat? The whole year round we eat cooked meat. And tonight I noticed that we didn't cook any meat. We're only eating roast meat. I don't know. That's a strange kind of an observation. Now he adds here on the next page, if you see on the top line, that's Kuf Tes Zayin Gimel in brackets. V'gam basar korban chagiga necha b'layla zeh dino lios tzli dafka. So here he's asking or implying a question and giving an answer. He doesn't even spell out the question, it's implicit. On this night, we eat more than just the meat of the Korban Pesach. We also eat the meat of the Korban Chagiga, which is an accompaniment to the Korban Pesach. So why are you telling me Kulot Tzli? And the answer is because it is Kulot Tzli, and the eating of the Chagiga as an accompaniment to the Korban Pesach has the same dinim as the Korban Pesach, and it has to be eaten tzli. And obviously we point out that this question would only be asked at the time of the Mikdash. Did somebody want to ask something? He writes here in footnote number Chavtes, She'ela zu hayisholim bizman HaMikdash. Aval bizman hazeh, she'enanu ochlim korban Pesach, ef shel yomro. And the Rashash says, Af al pi shegam bizman beis HaMikdash hayu rashoim lechol basar mevushal besuda, mikol makana ben rotza lefanav, roy lefanav, ato gam raket basar Pesach, ve'achagiga, shehuvu l'shulchan ve'im tzluyim. So the Rashash understands that this is an observation of something strange made by the child. Why is it that you brought 2 meats to the table, both of which are tzolin? That's unusual. And the Gemara is going to point out later that whether or not the basar chagiga has to be roasted like the Korban Pesach is a machlokes Tanoim. Our Mishnah reflects that sheet in Tanoim that the chagiga, like the Pesach, has to be eaten solid, sleep. So from the fact that the Rashash is emphasizing ben roeh lefanav ata, etc., he did not understand the Ma Nishtana the way we suggested. These are not 4 answers, but rather 4 questions. Now it's interesting that the Rashash uses the language roel lefana. In the question itself, the way the Mishnah formulates it, it says anu ochlim. The Rashash is apparently trying to avoid my question. Did the child actually see that we're eating basar tzli? We didn't get to the basar tzli yet. That's at the end of the Suda la Soma. But he's roel lefanav, what he sees in front of him on the table, apparently. Right, that's the kara, the shulchan. Right, we don't know what the kara looked like at the time of the Mikdash, but we can derive it by implication that the kara had basar pesach on it and basar chagig on it. And the child notices that you brought out two different portions of meat, both of which are tzli. That's very odd. And now we get to the last of the four questions. Shebechol elos anu matbilim pamachas. He has another girsa, ein anu matbilim afilu pamachas. Alayla zeh shtei piyom. Takes out the word afilu. Do you see that? And instead he sort of adds by implication the word rak. You know, he has einanu matbilin rak hamachas. So the question now is on the two tibul. The rest of the year we only do one tibul. The other girsa, which he rejects, is einanu matbilin afilu pamachas, which means that there's no chovas tibul even once. Tonight we have a chovas tibul of twice. And again, this would, you know, if you have the girsa of afilu pamachas, that can't be the observation of the child. He can't be saying that the whole year round we don't have even a single tibul. That makes no sense. So if your girsa is shebechol elos ein anu matbilin afilu pamachas, that can only make sense in the light of our interpretation that we're defining the kedushas hayom and the unique obligations that are generated therein. And one obligation is tibulim. And there's no obligation of tibul the rest of the year. Not even one tibul. And tonight we have to do two tibul. But we're going to take the other girsa and b'chol ha'leilos anu matbilin pamachas. We're going to add the word rak. Right? On the rest of the year we only do one tibul. And tonight we're doing two tibulim. And this is what the child observes. I mean, you have to lay down two premises. Number one, that the rest of the year they only do one tibul, not two. To do a second tibul the rest of the year is bal tosiv. I'm joking, I mean. And the second assumption is that he knows that tonight we are doing two tibulim. Whereas the second tibul is Mara B'charoses, which we haven't even gotten up to. But then again, you could ask me, how did he observe? All right, we had an answer to that question in the Rashash. You know, how did he observe two sleeves? I mean, slee comes at the end of the meal, and we're at the beginning of the meal. But the answer is he see that they bring it out to the table. It's interesting that there's no question about charoses. I don't believe that the rest of the year they ate charoses. And the Mishnah itself, back on Daf Kuf Yudalit, says that they bring him charoses. Am I right? Let's just go back to the Mishnah. Yeah. A view of fun of matzah vi chazeres vi charoses. Well, I don't know about the Shnei Tavshilin. Maybe that wouldn't arouse his curiosity. All right, there are different Tavshilin on the table. But charoses, I don't know, did he see charoses the rest of the year? I mean, yesterday we discussed charoses with Stephen.
So isn't that because we've already done the first dipping and we didn't use the charoses? He's saying, there's charoses on the table. We must be doing a second dipping with it. So he's kind of combining. He knows that there's going to be a second dipping and it's going to use the charoses.
So I think you're making 2 points here, Steve, and both points are correct. Point number one is, how does he know about Shnei Tibulim? And the answer is because they already brought out the charoses. And he realizes that the charos is being brought because of a second tibul. And secondly, your answer is that he doesn't ask about charoses because he's asking about tibul. And that's basically a question about charoses. Now, if you say charoses mishum kappa, for a health purpose, that it could be that whenever they did do tibul, they did it in charoses because the charoses has that power against the kappa. But I would add another point that if he's asking about the unique mitzvahs of the Laila, then charoses is not a mitzvah. And even if you hold like Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok that charoses is a mitzvah, it didn't get a bracha. Now, even if I hold that according to Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok, there was a bracha on charoses, charoses is part of tibul, which is part of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. So we've already covered that dimension of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim called charoses by mentioning tibul. There's no need to add another question about charoses. Ulefi daito shel ben aviv melamdo. What happened in Mitzrayim with our forefathers? There's so many different. There are endless nuances and embellishments of this Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim of all that befell our forefathers. So, what are we meant to teach? Lefi daito shel ben aviv melamdo. I emphasize the word teach because this halacha formulated by our Mishnah of Lefi daito shel ben aviv melamdo, and I emphasize the word melamdo, this is a fundamental principle in Talmud Torah. When we teach Torah, it's got to be lefi daito shel ben. Now, this lefi daito shel ben could be understood in terms of the various ages of the children at the table. And the older children are more mature, they know more, and they're more sophisticated. You can teach them beyond. The younger children have a more limited knowledge and perhaps, understanding of what's going on, and therefore you have to, as we say in Hebrew, lahatim, you have to make it fit to the das of the ben. But even if we forget about the different ages of the child, you can have a child who's younger and yet he has a greater capacity. He has been endowed with more sharp and profound, incisive intellectual capabilities than someone who is older than him. And of course, in contemporary, shall we say, sociology, we know, or education, whatever word you want to use, we know that there's certain children who are limited. Again, I don't want to use any word that sounds pejorative, like dull or whatever. You retarded, and you can have a Down syndrome child, and we know today that Down syndrome can mean so many different things. There's so many, there's advanced, more, and then there's the, those. So every child has to be taught lefi daito. What is his intellectual capacity? If you shoot too high, he won't understand it. And you've lost the game. You forfeited the game. The Rambam goes as far as to say that if the child is limited, either because of his age or because of his capability, then the Rambam says you should point to an Eved or a Shifcha and explain to the child, Avodim Ayinu, like this Eved or like this Shifcha. Okay, that's okay if you're very wealthy and you have your built-in Eved. To this day in certain countries of the world, I mean, it's changing very quickly, but you could, even if you're average financial, your middle-class status, you can still afford to have a built-in maid in certain countries. In Israel, you're lucky if you get any help in the house, But that's the Rambam is describing, I guess, the reality in Cairo in his time, or in Spain, and you could point to an Eved. Avodim Ayinu, tell the child who has a very limited grasp intellectually and comprehension level, tell him like this Eved. We will like this Eved. Doesn't sound politically correct. So which pasuk in Mishlei, this I'm testing you, so you have to unmute yourself if you know the answer to my quiz. Which pasuk in Tanakh would probably underlie, either consciously or subconsciously, the statement, the formulation of this Mishnah, Lefi Daito Shel Ben Oviv Malam? Anybody? Nobody. So there's a pasuk in Mishlei, very famous pasuk, Chanoch Linar Al Pi Darko. And this is something that, it sounds very modern and contemporary in the study of education. There's no standard education, meaning education has to be molded to fit the child's needs and capacity. But Chazal were aware of this concept in education way, way ahead of their time. You've all heard, of course, of the great Greek philosopher Plato, and he authored a book called Republic. And a lot of that book is about education. He also understood this principle of Lefi Daito Shel Ben Oviv Malam. Rav Soloveitchik goes very far with this. He wants to say that the essence of the mitzvah vigadita of Haggadah is teaching, is malanda. The entire structure of the Haggadah is all about Talmud Torah. He went as far as to say that maybe we should make a separate bracha on Talmud Torah, in addition to the bracha that he recited in the morning of the 14th of Nisan, like any other day of the year. on Talmud Torah, Lasok B'Divrei Torah, whatever your nusach is, there should be a special bracha on the Talmud Torah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. And that he understood based on the Shibbolei HaLeket is what the Haggadah means by Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu Baruch Asher Nasan Torah L'Am Yisrael. That itself is a special Birchas HaTorah for the Talmud Torah of this night of Pesach. And therefore, we're going to speak about the Dalet Banim, 4 categories of sons. Each one deserves to be taught in his own way. So you don't teach the Chacham the way you teach the Rasha, or vice versa. And this is why we take a parsha in the Torah tonight, on the night of Pesach, and we read it and we darshan it. Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. And that's the parsha of what? Arami Oved Avi, which is a synopsis in a very short, abbreviated form of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. But we're going to take every phrase in that parsha and we're going to interpret it based on Midrashi Chazal. And that is a paradigmic example of Talmud Torah. To learn Torah Shebechsav and then interpret it based on Torah Shebal Peh. And the requirement of She'ela Utshuva, and as we said before, Aviv Malando means in this Mishnah that his father has to teach him to ask the question, not to teach him the answer. Teach him to ask the question. That is a fundamental principle in Talmud Torah. That the Torah should be taught in question and answer form. And Rav Soloveitchik pointed out that the answer to the Ben HaChacham, Ein Maftirin Achar Pesach Avikoman, is because the Talmud Torah to be taught to the Chacham is on the highest level. And the Vilna Gaon, Rav Soloveitchik always used to point out, adds one word, which I don't think we have in our Agadas. Ad ein maftir nachar Pesach havikom. Ad means until you get to the last Mishnah in Masechet Pesachim. It basically means that you should teach the Ben HaChacham the entire Masechet Pesachim, all the laws, all the dinim, the chukim and mishpatim that are relevant to the Seder night, the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, to the Haggadah, to the Korban Pesach, and the last halacha in Hilchas Korban Pesach is Ein Maftirin Achar Afikoma. The Korban Pesach has to eat an ala sova, and don't eat any desserts after you ate the Korban Pesach. Sheitam Pesach b'fiv. That's what we have to do. We have to teach the Chacham Torah, because tonight, the night of Tesvav B'Nisan, is the night of Talmud Torah. It's Lefi Daito Shel Ben Aviv Maland. Now, what happened to Mesubin? If you take a look at footnote number Lamed Beis, he points out in the name of the Tiferes Yisrael that there's a certain definite sequence in asking these questions. You start with matzah, then you go to morar, and then to Pesach. And that's the way we bring it in front of him. Pesach, matzah, morar, and Pesach. What happened to the question of Mesubin? Says Rav Saadia Gaon, and you'll find it elsewhere in the Rambam and the Masechet Vitri and other Rishonim, that this should be included in the Nishtana. And now we're going to have to end, but B'li Neder, tomorrow we can talk about the Rogachover, the Tzofnas Paneh. Now I understand, Steve, that you're not going to be here tomorrow. Jeff, I always forget which days you come on. You have to always remind me of that. So Thursday is not on your list, is it? If I remember.
Well, this year doesn't meet on Thursday.
Oh, what's our Thursday schedule? Remind me. I give a daf yomi at 9:45, and then what happens after daf yomi? What?
Right. So we meet around 10:50, 10:55.
10:50, 10:55.
But John said he was going to be here.
Okay, we'll try. We'll see what we can do. I'm not committed, but B'li Neder, we'll be in touch. All right, then. Everyone should have a great day. Thank you so much.